In the gilded halls of power, death has never respected a crown. Some royals died on thrones, others on toilets. Some were slain in war, others by dinner. A few simply vanished. These aren't the noble ends you read in textbooks. These are the bizarre, the absurd, the forgotten footnotes of royal history. 33 crown-wearing catastrophes that prove one thing. No matter how blue your blood is, death has a sense of humor. Welcome to 33 most bizarre British royal deaths, where the crown doesn't save you, and history has a wicked punchline. Before we descend into royal chaos, take a second to subscribe, especially if you like your history with a twist of dark irony and a dash of absurdity. While you're at it, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? I want to know who's joining this royal roll call of the weird and the wonderfully doomed. 1. William the Conqueror. The exploding funeral. They called him the Conqueror, but death conquered him back, slowly, messily, and with a bang that still echoes through history. William I, Duke of Normandy turned King of England, carved his name into the bedrock of British history with blood, ambition, and bureaucracy. He invented the Domesday Book, reshaped feudalism, and introduced the idea that maybe England needed more castles and fewer rebellions. But for all his grandeur in life, his death was a lesson in the grotesque mechanics of royal mortality, and how, even for a man who defeated Harold with an arrow to the face, the final battle is always against bloat. The beginning of William's end came not in glorious battle or palace intrigue, but in Normandy, during a petty dispute with the French. While sacking a town, a retirement hobby of medieval monarchs, William's horse stumbled, sending his large and aging body lurching forward onto the saddle pommel. Internal injuries followed. Not a noble sword wound, not even a villainous dagger, just a royal gut punch by his own horse and gravity. The injury festered for weeks. Infection crept in, and the great conqueror deflated in spirit as his body began its slow, grotesque swelling. By the time he died, on September 9, 1087, he was alone, abandoned by most of his court. The nobles had already scattered to secure their own lands. Apparently, loyalty has an expiration date, and William had passed his. But the true punchline of this medieval tragedy came during the funeral. Because William had gained weight in life, and far more in death. His decaying corpse had bloated grotesquely in the summer heat. When the clergy tried to fit his body into a stone sarcophagus, which naturally had been carved too small, they applied pressure, and in that pressure, they unlocked a moment of dark legend. According to chroniclers, his abdomen burst open in the church. The explosion sent a foul stench through the air so powerful that mourners reportedly ran for the doors, gagging. The priest tried to carry on the mass because of course he did, but the mood had shifted. William the Conqueror, scourge of Saxons and builder of empires, had become a cautionary tale about coffins, decomposition, and perhaps the vanity of power. There's a strange irony here. In life, William had compressed a kingdom under his rule. In death, his body rebelled against compression. Even his corpse refused to be conquered. The moment was more than grotesque. It was symbolic. A king who'd reshaped England was now reshaping his own funeral. The smell of rotting flesh lingered in the air. A reminder that no matter how high you rise, your last act might still be slapstick. The domes were grand, the prayers solemn, but the sound that stayed with people was the wet pop of royal organs against limestone. And just like that, the man who'd brought the Normans to England left behind a final gift, a death so absurd, so humiliating, so viscerally ironic, that it would survive 1,000 years of revisionism. But William's was only the beginning. England had no shortage of monarchs, and fate had no shortage of creative exits. If being stuffed into a coffin like a rotting sausage seems like rock bottom, wait until you meet the king who got assassinated from underneath his own toilet. 2. King Edmund Ironside. Stabbed on the toilet. History rarely offers privacy, And if you're a medieval king, even your most private moments can become part of a public legend. So it went with Edmund Ironside, the short-reigned Saxon king, whose death is best known for its spectacular blend of betrayal, bathroom, and bottomless speculation. Edmund was no weakling. In fact, his epithet Ironside wasn't just for show. He earned it fighting back against a Danish invasion led by Canute the Great. Yes, that Canute, the one later accused of trying to command the tide. The early 11th century was a chaotic time. Viking raids, collapsing monarchies, and the kind of political instability that makes modern constitutional crises look like poorly scheduled tea breaks. Edmund came to power in 1016, in the midst of all this upheaval. His father, King Ethelred the Unready, whose name suggests both bad timing and worse planning, had recently died, leaving behind a legacy of dithering and defeat. Edmund, by contrast, was young, aggressive, and determined not to let the Danes take England without a fight. He waged several brutal campaigns against Canute, and won enough battles to earn respect, if not control of the entire country. Eventually, the two kings agreed to split the kingdom. Edmund would rule Wessex in the south, while Canute held the north. It was an uneasy truce, but it brought a flicker of peace to a war-weary land. Then, just 7 weeks after the agreement, Edmund dropped dead. That's when the real mystery began. According to later chroniclers, who, let's be honest, never missed a chance to spice up royal deaths, Edmund was killed on the toilet, stabbed from below by an assassin who had concealed himself in the royal latrine. The story goes that as the king sat down to relieve himself, the hidden killer struck upward with a dagger or spear, killing him instantly. It's a scene so ridiculous it sounds like the setup to a medieval slapstick. The noble warrior king, felled not by blade on battlefield, but by betrayal through a privy hole. Is it true? Maybe. The more sober accounts simply say Edmund died suddenly, or by treachery. The lavatory legend didn't appear until much later, and may have been political propaganda. A colorful insult meant to paint Edmund as weak, unclean, or literally caught with his pants down. The actual cause of death might have been poison, ambush, or even natural causes, though natural causes in 1016 could mean anything from a minor infection to falling over the wrong way. Still, the toilet tale stuck, and that says something. It reveals how vulnerable even the most iron-willed king truly was. One moment you're dividing a kingdom, the next you're a historical punchline. But let's consider the symbolism. Edmund, the last great hope of the Saxon resistance, goes out not in glory, but in secrecy and humiliation. The setting, a royal latrine, underlines the absurdity of monarchy, that a man crowned by God could be unmade by a man hiding in his plumbing. And it raises a grim little question. Is it worse to die in battle, or to be remembered forever as the king killed on the can? Edmund's death gave Canute total control of England, ushering in a new Danish dynasty. As for Edmund himself, he was buried at Glastonbury Abbey, his resting place marked with dignity, even if his legend remained anything but. And yet, in the twisted hierarchy of bizarre royal deaths, Edmund may still count himself lucky. After all, his body stayed intact. Unlike Edward II, whose enemies allegedly took a much more creative and deeply infamous route to royal revenge. If you're still here after a royal assassination in a medieval bathroom, you're clearly our kind of viewer. So go ahead, subscribe for more darkly fascinating tales from the corners of history they don't teach in school. And while we're pausing, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it over there? I'm always curious who's joining this late-night dive into the absurd. 3. King Edward II. The infamous red-hot poker. Edward II was never meant to be a mystery. He was meant to be a king, one in a long line of Plantagenet rulers who were supposed to maintain the balance between English ambition and political reality. But Edward, it turns out, had a gift for neither. He came to the throne in 1307, following the death of his father, Edward I, the so-called Hammer of the Scots, and one of the more formidable kings in English memory. Edward II, by contrast, was softer, more romantic, more interested in pageantry than politics. He adored music, poetry, architecture, and, to the horror of his barons, a string of male favorites who wielded influence far beyond their stations. This alone wouldn't have guaranteed a bizarre death. But Edward had the misfortune of ruling during a time when tolerance was not in fashion, and trust among nobles was about as stable as a flaming trebuchet. His favoritism toward Piers Gaveston, a dashing Gascon with questionable political savvy, enraged the barons. They saw Gaveston as a parasite, leeching off royal favor while undermining traditional power structures. Repeatedly, the barons demanded Gaveston's exile. Repeatedly, Edward brought him back. Eventually, they took matters into their own hands. Gaveston was captured, tried, and executed by a coalition of nobles. Edward never forgave them. But rather than learn from the fallout, he found himself yet another close companion, Hugh Despenser the Younger, and repeated the cycle. Patronage, scandal, revenge. It was monarchy as melodrama, and Edward was determined to play the lead. By the 1320s, England was unraveling. The barons were in open revolt. His own wife, Queen Isabella, had gone from neglected royal spouse to cold-eyed revolutionary. She partnered with Roger Mortimer, a powerful lord with his own grievances, and together they led a successful invasion of England, while Edward dithered and flailed. He fled, was captured, and ultimately deposed in 1327, not just by his enemies, but with the chilling complicity of Parliament and his own son. What followed was imprisonment, humiliation, and a death that remains one of the most hotly debated and morbidly embellished episodes in royal history. The official record simply says Edward died in captivity at Berkeley Castle. Some say it was illness. Others claim he was quietly murdered by suffocation. But the most persistent, and certainly the most bizarre version, involves a red-hot poker. This account, which emerged decades later, alleged that Edward was killed by a device inserted in a way meant to leave no outward marks, a method chosen specifically to conceal the murder and preserve the illusion of natural death. It was theatrical, cruel, and symbolic, and not coincidentally a narrative his enemies found highly convenient. Whether it happened that way or not is impossible to prove. Most modern historians view it as propaganda, a posthumous insult wrapped in lurid metaphor. But the fact that it stuck, that it remains one of the first things anyone learns about Edward II, says something profound about power, rumor, and the thirst for symbolic justice. For his enemies, Edward was more than a failed king. He was a cautionary tale, a man who blurred lines, upended norms, and, in the eyes of his peers, needed a punishment to match the offense. His death became a myth not because it was confirmed, but because it was useful. The poker story isn't a historical certainty. It's a kind of political theater, a grotesque joke passed down through centuries of textbooks and tavern whispers. But if Edward II's death represents the crown's capacity for humiliation, the next king on our list took things one step further, turning a royal craving for forbidden food into a lethal eel-flavored lesson in appetite and arrogance. 4. King Henry I, Death by Lamprey Eels. In the grand scheme of royal absurdity, Henry I's death stands out not for its violence, scandal, or conspiracy, but for the sheer stubbornness of a man who believed that, as king, even his digestive tract owed him obedience. Henry I, son of William the Conqueror, ruled England from 1100 to 1135. He was, by most accounts, a competent, if not particularly charismatic monarch. He loved order, hated rebellion, and adored writing laws down on actual paper, which for a medieval king made him something of a radical. He also had a reputation for being strategic, shrewd, and ruthlessly pragmatic, a man who once blinded his own grandchildren's cousins to settle a political dispute. Family gatherings must have been tense. But what history most remembers about Henry isn't his political savvy or his vast illegitimate brood. he sired at least 20 children outside of wedlock, but his gluttonous, almost religious devotion to a certain slippery delicacy, the lamprey. Now, for the uninitiated, lampreys are not fish in the way a salmon is a fish. They are more like aquatic leeches with teeth, the medieval equivalent of an edible horror story. They're jawless, parasitic, and shaped like something you'd expect to see sliding out of a cursed relic. And Henry couldn't get enough of them. His physicians, understandably concerned, warned him repeatedly, "Stop eating them. They're not good for your health, especially not when eaten in large quantities over several days, in a period of questionable refrigeration." But Henry, in classic monarch fashion, waved them off. A king, after all, does not bow to fish warnings. And so, while staying in Normandy in 1135, at the castle of Lyon-la-Forêt, Henry indulged in a particularly generous helping of lampreys, reportedly despite his doctor's strict instructions. Almost immediately after, he fell violently ill. Contemporary accounts are vague on the details, but the symptoms suggest food poisoning or some sort of intestinal failure. Whatever it was swift and decisive. Henry III, a man who once outmaneuvered enemies, forged Anglo-Norman stability, and married off his daughter Matilda in a calculated move to secure the succession, died because he simply couldn't say no to a plate of slimy parasitic eels. His death left England in chaos. Henry had hoped to pass the throne peacefully to his daughter, but the nobles had other plans. They refused to accept a woman as ruler and instead backed her cousin Stephen, triggering a civil war known as the Anarchy, a 2-decade-long mess of sieges, betrayals, and famine that nearly broke the country apart. All of which might have been avoided had Henry just ordered the chicken instead. But here lies the irony. In trying to control everything, laws, marriages, rebellions, inheritance, Henry was ultimately undone by the one thing he refused to discipline: himself. His appetite became his undoing. The man who once commanded armies couldn't command his own dinner plate. Of course, being undone by your own desires is practically a royal tradition. Just ask James II of Scotland, a king who believed in the power of big, loud cannons, until one of them decided to have the final word. 5. King James II of Scotland. Cannon explosion. There are few deaths in royal history that capture both the promise of innovation and the peril of impatience, quite like that of King James II of Scotland. His end didn't come by sword, poison, or political betrayal. No, James was taken out by a piece of technology he adored a little too much. A cannon. More specifically, his cannon. And its final message was written in smoke and iron. James II ruled Scotland from 1437 to 1460, ascending the throne at just 6 years old after his father was murdered in a dark conspiratorial plot that involved nobles, a sewer tunnel, and an ill-fated tennis ball. More on that later. Like many child kings, James's early reign was more of a puppet show run by ambitious lords. But as he grew older, James took control, decisively, and sometimes brutally. Unlike some of his royal peers, James was not content to be remembered as a placeholder king. He wanted to modernize Scotland's military and bring feuding nobles to heel. He was fascinated by artillery, which at the time was still something of a novelty in European warfare. Cannons, bombards, and other early firearms were the cutting edge, loud, terrifying, and often as dangerous to the user as to the enemy. Still, to James, they symbolized modernity, strength, and control. He didn't just admire these machines from afar, he personally oversaw their use in siege warfare. In 1460, James led a campaign to reclaim Roxburgh Castle, one of the last strongholds still held by the English after decades of conflict. Determined to make a show of force, he brought with him a number of heavy artillery pieces, including his pride and joy, a massive cannon named the Lion. It was during this siege, with victory in sight, that fate, or rather faulty metallurgy, intervened. James stood near the Lion as it was fired. Whether he was giving orders, observing with royal pride, or simply indulging in a bit of battlefield drama is unclear. What is known is that the cannon exploded without warning, possibly due to a flaw in its casting or overloading of powder. Shrapnel flew in all directions. The king was killed instantly, the force of the blast leaving no time for final words or dramatic farewells, just a bang, and silence. It was a death so sudden, so absurd, and so poetically aligned with the king's obsessions that it almost feels fictional. A monarch who embraced technology, who believed in the might of modern warfare, brought low not by enemy swords, but by the very symbol of his military ambition. A self-inflicted end, not by his hand, but by his pride. His death caused chaos. The siege still had to be won. His body was carried away, while his young son, just 9 years old, was proclaimed James III on the battlefield. The Scots took the castle shortly after, but at a heavy and ironic price. James II may be remembered as a forward-thinking king, but history tends to recall the punchline, the king who was quite literally blown away by his own weapon. And yet, as bizarre as it was to be undone by iron and fire, at least James's death left no ambiguity. The next royal on our list wasn't just killed, he was blown up and strangled, just to be absolutely sure. 6. Prince Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Blown up, then strangled. In the long catalogue of royal deaths that flirt with the ridiculous, few are quite as excessive or suspiciously thorough as that of Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. It's one thing to be murdered. It's another thing entirely to be exploded, smothered, and possibly poisoned, all in a single evening, in what remains one of the most elaborately overdetermined deaths in royal history. Darnley was not just anyone. He was the second husband of Mary, Queen of Scots, and, on paper, a perfect match. Both were grandchildren of Margaret Tudor, linking them to the English crown. His tall stature, golden hair, and royal blood made him, at least in theory, a worthy consort. Unfortunately, in practice, Darnley brought a different kind of spark to the marriage, the wrong kind. After marrying Mary in 1565, he quickly revealed himself to be arrogant, insecure, and wildly self-indulgent. He demanded the crown matrimonial, essentially co-sovereignty, which Mary refused to grant. He was also openly jealous of her advisor and secretary David Rizzio, a relationship he interpreted as politically threatening and perhaps personally humiliating. So Darnley did what insecure royals often do. He plotted. In 1566, he helped orchestrate the murder of Rizzio, right in front of the pregnant queen, stabbing him dozens of times in her private chambers. It was an act that horrified the court and shattered Mary's trust in Darnley forever. Their marriage, already strained, became a cold war of silences and public appearances. Then, in 1567, came the end. Darnley was recovering from a mysterious illness, possibly smallpox, possibly something more political, while staying at a house in Edinburgh called Kirk of Field. On the night of February 9th, the house was blown sky-high by 2 massive explosions. The blast was heard across the city. Debris rained from the sky. And yet, when Darnley's body was found the next morning, it wasn't buried in rubble or burned. It was lying calmly in the garden, unscathed by fire, with no visible injuries from the explosion. What it did have, according to witnesses, were signs of strangulation. In other words, someone had gone to considerable effort to blow up a house, and then, just in case that didn't work, dragged the prince outside and finished the job manually. It was a murder overachieving in every possible way, and the prime suspect, at least in public opinion, was Mary's new associate, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a man with a conveniently timed rise to power and an even more conveniently rapid marriage to the now widowed queen. The fallout was swift. Mary's reputation collapsed. Her marriage to Bothwell, which followed just months later, sealed her political fate. Rebellion surged. She was forced to abdicate. Darnley, whose death should have been the end of one problem, became the start of a national crisis. But Darnley's death remains strangely suspended in ambiguity. Part assassination, part demolition, all wrapped in a haze of overkill. No one was ever convicted. The case was muddled by politics, alliances, and Scotland's endless appetite for internal drama. And yet, if Darnley's death was theatrical, at least it involved deliberate human hands. The next king on our list needed no court intrigue. Just one stormy Scottish night, one stubborn royal ego, and one poorly timed ride straight off a cliff. 7. King Alexander III of Scotland. Cliff. After dark. Some kings die in battle, others at the hands of traitors or the slow decay of illness. But Alexander III of Scotland managed to slip into legend by doing something entirely unremarkable: riding a horse. At night. In a storm. Off a cliff. It was 1286 and Alexander was in his prime. By all measures, he was a successful monarch. Under his rule, Scotland had enjoyed a period of peace, prosperity, and relative independence from English interference. An impressive feat, considering his southern neighbor was none other than Edward I, a man better known as the Hammer of the Scots. But Alexander had done something most Scottish kings struggled with. He kept the peace and the throne. He had 3 children, all married into influential European houses. The royal line looked stable. The future looked bright. Then, suddenly, it didn't. In the early months of 1286, tragedy had begun to nibble at the edges of Alexander's well-ordered world. His wife, Queen Yolande, had recently died. His adult children had predeceased him. All that remained of his direct heirs was his granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, a 3-year-old living across the sea. But Alexander wasn't worried. Not yet. He was only in his mid-40s and reportedly still strong, healthy, and clear-headed. There was time to remarry. Time to produce another heir. And so, on a blustery March evening, he set out from Edinburgh to be with his new queen in Fife. That decision would prove fatal. Despite the stormy weather, the failing light, and the repeated protests of his advisors, Alexander insisted on making the journey across the Forth estuary on horseback. His guards pleaded with him to wait until morning. He refused. He was the king. Kings don't reschedule. Somewhere near Kinghorn, in the darkness, he became separated from his escort. The terrain was rough, the cliffs steep, the wind deafening. When they found him the next day, it was too late. His horse had apparently stumbled in the dark or missed a turn on the coastal path. Alexander had fallen, or been thrown, off a cliff to the rocks below. No war, no battle cry, just one fatal misstep in the dark. The irony is hard to ignore. A king who had navigated 2 decades of political minefields with grace and grit, brought down not by rebellion or assassination, but by his own determination to stick to the plan. He died trying to get home, late, in a storm on horseback, like a royal version of a missed exit on a rainy night. His death marked the beginning of one of the most turbulent periods in Scottish history. With no clear adult heir, the kingdom fell into a crisis of succession. The English crown began to press its claim, and the wars of Scottish independence, featuring William Wallace, Robert the Bruce, and more blood than reason, were just around the corner. Still, Alexander's sudden end has a strange finality. One wrong turn, and the light of a golden rain went out like a candle in the wind. But while his death was accidental, the next king's demise was technically an accident too, though it just so happened to involve an arrow, a royal forest, and a suspiciously convenient disappearance of suspects. 8. King William II. Rufus. The hunting accident. In the deep tangled woods of the New Forest, where light filters through twisted branches and every rustle feels like a whisper, King William II, known as Rufus for his ruddy complexion and fiery temper, met a death that still raises eyebrows and suspicions nearly 1,000 years later. Rufus wasn't exactly the people's king. He was blunt, irreverent, and famously irreligious in a time when monarchs were expected to at least pretend otherwise. He wore flashy clothes, mocked the church, and taxed his subjects so harshly that even other kings winced on his behalf. His relationship with the nobility was strained. His court was viewed as scandalous, and while his political grip was firm, it lacked the charm or grace that made other rulers beloved in hindsight. Even his own chroniclers didn't like him much. On August 2nd, 1100, William set out for a hunting trip in the New Forest, an area that already had a grim reputation. Two of his relatives had previously died there under curious circumstances. It was a dense, unpredictable wilderness, home to wild boars, deep ravines, and rumors whispered just out of earshot. He was accompanied by a group of nobles, including Sir Walter Tyrrell, a Norman nobleman with a bow and an uncomfortably perfect aim. What happened next is the stuff of minimalist mystery. At some point during the hunt, an arrow was loosed. It struck William in the chest. According to the official version, it was an accident. Tyrrell had aimed at a deer, the king had stepped into the line of fire, and tragedy ensued. End of story, supposedly. Except, it wasn't. Because after William fell, no one checked on the body. No guards, no medics, no tearful lords. The royal party scattered. Tyrrell fled immediately to France. No investigation followed. No one was held accountable. And the king's corpse was left lying in the forest like an unwanted parcel, eventually discovered by a local charcoal burner who carted it to Winchester in an ox cart, his boots splashed with royal blood. The throne passed quickly and conveniently to William's younger brother, Henry I, who wasted no time securing the royal treasury and having himself crowned within days. It was all a bit tidy. Now, to be fair, accidents happen. Hunting was dangerous. Arrows misfire. But the silence, the speed, the fleeing nobleman, and the absence of any follow-up left historians and conspiracy lovers with a feast of questions. Was it a genuine accident? Or a silent coup wrapped in bark and plausibility? William Rufus died as he lived, alienated, inconvenient, and somewhat unresolved. The church, never fond of him, interpreted his death as divine retribution. Chroniclers called it judgment. But history leans toward something else, a mystery with too many missing voices and too many convenient silences. And as strange as an uninvestigated royal arrow might be, the next royal went down in a much more modern setting, with a plane crash that raises even more questions, including what he was really doing on board in the first place. 9. Prince George, Duke of Kent. Secret plane crash. In the shadowy overlap between war, royalty, and unspoken agendas, few deaths raise eyebrows quite like that of Prince George, Duke of Kent, the first British royal to die in military service in over 500 years, and the only one to perish in a mysterious World War II plane crash that has never been fully explained. Prince George wasn't your average stiff-collared royal. The fourth son of King George V and Queen Mary, he stood out in ways that both fascinated and unsettled the royal establishment. Charismatic, artistic, well-traveled, and charming to the point of gossip, he lived a life peppered with intrigue, high society drama, and more than a few well-guarded rumors. He had served in the Navy, dabbled in aviation, and even worked for the Foreign Office, a rare move for someone so close to the throne. Then the war came. By 1942, George had returned to active service, this time in the Royal Air Force. At age 39, he wasn't exactly at the front line, but his presence in uniform was symbolically significant. It sent a message. The royal family wasn't just watching the war from Buckingham Palace, they were in it, or at least near it. On August 25, 1942, Prince George boarded a Sunderland flying boat, a large, lumbering RAF aircraft, for what was officially described as a routine mission to Iceland. The exact nature of the mission? Never clearly explained. What we do know is that the plane crashed into a hillside in the Scottish Highlands shortly after takeoff, killing all but one of the crew. George was among the dead. Immediately, questions began to swirl. For one, George was not supposed to be on that flight. His name wasn't on the official crew list, and the route seemed unrelated to his known duties. For another, the aircraft had veered off course dramatically. And then there's the curious detail that some records from the crash were sealed for decades, only partially released under pressure from historians and public interest groups. Theories piled up. Was he on a secret diplomatic mission? Was there sabotage? Was it a tragic navigational error, or something else entirely? Some even speculated that George had been involved in back-channel efforts to open peace talks with Nazi Germany, though concrete evidence remains elusive. Others suggested he was carrying sensitive materials or documents, making the flight more dangerous than anyone admitted. The royal family, for their part, grieved privately. There was no public inquiry, no parade of clarity, just a quiet burial and a few lines in the official war records. Prince George's death remains an open-ended chapter, a royal tragedy nested inside a wartime enigma. A man born into privilege, surrounded by rumors, gone in a flash with more questions than answers. And yet, compared to the cold calculus behind George's crash, the next death on our list was chillingly deliberate, timed not for battle, duty, or secrecy, but for the perfect front-page headline in the morning paper. 10. King George V. Mercy killed for the morning papers. When King George V died in 1936, the official story was dignified and restrained. He passed peacefully, surrounded by family, his legacy secure, his final breath marked with reverence. But behind the curtain of royal decorum, history tells a different, stranger tale. A monarch gently eased into death not for mercy's sake, but for the convenience of Britain's press schedule. George V wasn't a dramatic king. In fact, he went out of his way to avoid drama. He loved stamp collecting, shooting birds, and a good cup of tea. He was a creature of routine, temperamentally conservative and committed to duty in the quietest sense of the word. His reign oversaw the First World War, the crumbling of empires, and the beginning of the modern monarchy as a media-managed institution. Through it all, George adapted, not brilliantly, but steadily. By the early 1930s, his health had begun to fail. Years of heavy smoking had ravaged his lungs, and by 1935 he was suffering from chronic bronchitis, weakened circulation, and increasing fatigue. Doctors kept a watchful eye. The king kept to his routines. He was not a man prone to emotional displays, and his decline was met with the same stoic grumbles he applied to most things. But in January 1936, things took a sharper turn. George became bedridden, slipping in and out of consciousness. His breathing was labored. The end was clearly approaching. Here's where things get peculiar. Unbeknownst to the public, and for a time to much of the royal family, the king's physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, had prepared a plan. On the night of January 20th, with George drifting in a semi-coma, Dawson administered a lethal combination of morphine and cocaine, effectively ending the king's life. The purpose? Not to relieve pain, George was already unconscious, but to ensure that his death could be announced in the morning edition of the Times, rather than the less dignified evening tabloids. The timing, in other words, was curated. Dawson later wrote about it in his private diary, which wasn't made public until decades later. The act was framed not as euthanasia, but as a kind of royal stage management, ensuring that the monarch's final curtain call happened at precisely the right hour, under precisely the right spotlight. No scandal followed, mostly because no one knew. For years the official line held, peaceful, natural, and suitably majestic. But behind that facade was a quiet decision made by a doctor who believed he was safeguarding the image of the crown, even if it meant choosing the exact hour a king would die. It's a strange echo of modern PR culture, but dressed in Edwardian lace. A royal death, tailored to fit the front page. Yet while George V's end was calculated and clean, the next royal's death was anything but. Because no matter how noble the bloodline, even kings must beware the porcelain throne. 11. King George II died on the toilet. Monarchs have fallen in battle, perished in plots, and disappeared into political black holes. But King George II of Great Britain managed to check out in a way that was both mundane and majestically humiliating, while using the facilities. His was not a death of grand intrigue, but of biological betrayal, and it came not from enemy blades, but from a sudden shift inside the body of a man who never saw it coming. George II reigned from 1727 to 1760, a relatively long stint marked by imperial expansion abroad and political entrenchment at home. He wasn't the warmest king, blunt, argumentative, and easily agitated, but he was consistent. He enjoyed war more than peacetime, famously led troops into battle at the age of 60, and ruled in an age when the real power was increasingly shifting toward Parliament and the Prime Minister. Still, George kept a firm grip on matters that interested him: military campaigns, Hanoverian affairs, and his beloved early morning routines. One of those routines, of course, involved the morning visit to the chamber pot. Hardly a glamorous tradition, but an inescapable one for kings and commoners alike. On the morning of October 25, 1760, George woke early, as was his habit. He took some chocolate, paced briefly, and then retreated to his private closet, a modest euphemism for the royal toilet. Minutes later, a crashing sound echoed through the rooms. Servants rushed in to find the king collapsed on the floor, unresponsive. He had suffered what we now understand as a massive aortic aneurysm, a catastrophic failure of the artery that can cause sudden death with little to no warning. And just like that, George II was gone, instantly, undramatically, undignified. In the autopsy that followed, conducted out of both duty and curiosity, it was found that his heart was unusually dilated and had ruptured at the base. Medical language aside, it was a reminder that even monarchs with palaces, armies, and powdered wigs were still subject to the brute mechanics of the human body. What makes this death so memorable isn't its tragedy. It's the setting. The final throne was not golden or symbolic, but ceramic and functional. There was no courtly farewell, no gathered family, no whispered last words about legacy or lineage, just the quiet routine of a king starting his day, and the final irony of history interrupting him mid-habit. And yet, there's something oddly democratic about it. George II, who once led troops into battle and sparred with ministers over state secrets, met his end just like anyone else might, abruptly, and with no chance to clean things up. It was a death that stripped the monarchy of its mystique, if only for a moment. A reminder that behind the robes and titles, there are hearts and arteries, and that none of them come with guarantees. But if George's death was ordinary made royal, the next is royal made chaotic. A prince who shot himself, survived, then tried to drink his way back to health, and failed. 12. Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh. Bullet and alcohol. Royal deaths often arrive with a certain choreography. Illnesses watched by physicians, public statements crafted by press secretaries, memorials prepared in advance. But Prince Alfred, second son of Queen Victoria, managed to die in a way that felt more like a tragic farce. Self-inflicted, drawn out, and soaked in poor decisions. Alfred was not born to inherit the British throne. That job went to his older brother, the future Edward VII. Instead, Alfred carved out a respectable royal resume of his own. He joined the Royal Navy at a young age, traveled extensively, became the Duke of Edinburgh, and even ended up ruling as Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a small but significant German duchy inherited from his uncle. On paper, he was everything a spare royal should be: dutiful, distinguished, and out of the spotlight. But the trouble came not with Alfred himself, but with his only son, also named Alfred, Prince Alfred of Edinburgh and Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a young man who, from the start, seemed overwhelmed by the twin expectations of royalty and masculinity. By the late 1890s, this younger Alfred had become the subject of quiet royal concern. He was under pressure to marry a Russian princess, uphold family honor, and live up to the militarized, disciplined legacy his father embodied. He was failing at all three. Then, in 1899, during his parents' 25th wedding anniversary celebrations, he shot himself. The details remain unclear. Some reports say it happened during a private moment at the castle. Others suggest it was an impulsive act brought on by family pressure and personal dissatisfaction. What we do know is that the shot wasn't instantly fatal. He survived, though badly wounded, and was taken away under the shroud of royal secrecy. In the months that followed, he was moved to a sanatorium in Murano, Italy, an alpine town often used to politely hide Europe's broken aristocracy. There, instead of healing, things took another tragic turn. While recovering, Alfred reportedly consumed large amounts of alcohol, possibly as a means of coping with the pain, both physical and emotional. This, combined with his weakened condition, eventually overwhelmed his system. He died in 1900 at the age of just 24, leaving behind a family stunned and a court scrambling to keep the details quiet. The British royal family never officially acknowledged the full story during Queen Victoria's lifetime. The narrative was tidied, the tragedy folded into a broader tale of sudden illness, and the real events left to fade behind closed doors and whispered biographies. What lingers is the portrait of a young man crushed by dynastic weight, a prince who could travel the world but couldn't escape the pressure of his own name. And while Alfred's end was private and slow, the next royal death on our list happened in full public view. A king stabbed at the doorstep, betrayed while offering kindness to his own family. 13. King Edward the Martyr. Murdered at the doorstep. The line between royalty and martyrdom has always been thin, but King Edward, later known as Edward the Martyr, crossed it with startling speed, and at the hands of those he should have trusted most. Edward became King of England in 975, succeeding his father, King Edgar the Peaceful. He was about 13 or 14 at the time, depending on which chronicler you ask, and his ascension was immediately met with resistance. His claim was legitimate, but contested by powerful nobles who supported his younger half-brother, Ethelred. The question wasn't whether Edward had royal blood, he clearly did, but whether he had the right backing. In Anglo-Saxon England, kingship was as much about alliances as lineage. Still, Edward was crowned, and for the 3 short years of his reign, he struggled to hold together a kingdom rife with factionalism. His court was divided, the nobility uneasy, and the church heavily involved in politics. Most historians agree that Edward showed signs of piety and strength of character, but he was also young, impulsive, and at times heavy-handed in his reforms, traits that didn't win him many friends among the power brokers of the realm. Then, in 978, at the age of just 16 or 17, Edward rode alone, some say with only a small guard, to visit his stepmother, Queen Elfthryth, and his half-brother, the future Ethelred the Unready, at Corfe Castle in Dorset. The meeting was meant to be a familial one, or at least a gesture of peace. Edward reportedly approached the residence unarmed and in good faith. As he arrived, a servant came forward with a drink. Some accounts say wine. And as the young king accepted it, he was suddenly attacked. The specifics of the attack differed depending on the version of the story, but the key elements remain consistent. Edward was stabbed while still on his horse, and the animal bolted in panic. The mortally wounded king clung to the saddle as it galloped away, eventually collapsing and dying in the woods nearby. No formal investigation followed. His body was hastily buried, hidden even, before being exhumed and reinterred by supporters who quickly began to venerate him as a saint. The culprits were never officially named, but suspicion has always hovered heavily over Elfthryth and those who supported her son's claim to the throne. The timing was, after all, convenient. With Edward dead, Ethelred became king, albeit one with a notoriously disastrous reign. Edward's posthumous reputation only grew. He was canonized by the Church within a few decades of his death, his youth and violent end rebranded as holy martyrdom. Churches were named after him. Pilgrimages made in his honor. A royal teenager, transformed by betrayal into a sacred symbol. It's a story that echoes through time. the idealistic youth cut down before his prime, not by foreign enemies or battlefield chaos, but by his own bloodline. A royal death at the doorstep, quiet, sudden, and treacherous. But if Edward's downfall came from a single blade, the next king's undoing came from something far more pedestrian, a bad snack and some very questionable beer. 14. King John. Death by peaches and beer. For a king best remembered as the villain in the Robin Hood tales, King John's actual death feels weirdly anticlimactic. Almost like a joke history tells with a straight face. No arrows in the back, no treacherous daggers in the dark. Just peaches and beer, and a very bad decision. John's reign, from 1199 to 1216, was already a tangle of disasters before he ever got to the fruit course. He lost Normandy to the French, taxed his barons into open rebellion, and famously sealed the Magna Carta, a document designed to restrain royal power, which he agreed to and then immediately tried to ignore. He also managed to get himself excommunicated by the Pope, plunged England into civil war, and accidentally turned his entire court into a cautionary tale for how not to lead a medieval superpower. So by the autumn of 1216, John was on the run, again. The First Barons' War had broken out. A faction of English nobles had invited Prince Louis of France to invade and take the crown, which he eagerly accepted. John, in response, took his remaining loyal forces and began a campaign of frantic castle hopping, trying to rally support and outmaneuver enemies. It was on one of these hurried journeys that he reached Newark Castle, tired, under pressure, and, as legend has it, very, very hungry. And that's where the peaches come in. According to chroniclers, John was served a meal that included a quantity of unripe peaches and a generous helping of ale or cider, depending on the source. The fruit was fresh off the tree, probably too fresh, and the drink likely spoiled. Whether it was overindulgence or a simple case of bad luck, the result was catastrophic. John developed an acute and violent case of dysentery, a condition that, in the medieval world, was as common as it was deadly. He suffered for several days before dying on October 18, 1216. His last days were spent in pain, surrounded by a dwindling court and the distant sounds of an invading army. No poetic death scene, no noble last words, just the consequence of a reckless meal during a desperate retreat. The irony writes itself. A king brought low not by rebellion, betrayal, or war, but by poor digestion. A monarch who had tried to rewrite the laws of the land, undone by the laws of his stomach. It's a death so unheroic, so embarrassingly human, that it almost softens his legacy. Almost. But in a reign defined by mismanagement and alienation, even his death had to be a little chaotic. The man who lost a kingdom couldn't even win dinner. And while John's exit was marked by illness, the next royal death was soaked in something a bit more celebratory. A barrel of wine, to be precise. A nobleman who, legend claims, was executed by drowning in his favorite vintage. 15. Prince George, Duke of Clarence. Drowned in wine. Some royal deaths are tragic, others suspicious, and a rare few are so absurdly theatrical that they blur the line between court record and dark folklore. The death of Prince George, Duke of Clarence, younger brother to King Edward IV and elder brother to the future Richard III, falls squarely into the last category. Because if legend is to be believed, George Clarence didn't die by sword or poison or battlefield fate. No, he died drowning in a barrel of wine. Malmsey wine, to be exact. And it's that detail, the specific, sweet, heady vintage, that's kept his death fermenting in the public imagination for over 5 centuries. George was born into the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, that violent, convoluted struggle between the houses of York and Lancaster for the English throne. He was a Yorkist by blood and by politics, but ambition tends to blur loyalties. For a time, George was fiercely loyal to his elder brother, Edward IV. He was named Duke of Clarence, granted land and titles, and welcomed into the innermost circle of royal favor. But George wanted more. specifically the crown. When Edward married Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner with a large and power-hungry family, George bristled. He saw the new queen and her relatives as a threat to his influence. So, naturally, he switched sides, allying himself with the kingmaker, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, and backing a rebellion against his own brother. It failed, spectacularly. But Edward, in a moment of political pragmatism, or perhaps familial sentiment, forgave George. Sort of. He restored his titles and welcomed him back to court. But the trust was gone. George, too proud or too paranoid to behave, started sowing discord once again. He accused Elizabeth Woodville of witchcraft. He allegedly spread rumors about royal illegitimacy. He even had one of her household servants tried and executed for treason on extremely shaky evidence, an act so bold it could only have one outcome. In 1477, George was arrested for treason. Parliament passed the Act of Attainder, stripping him of his titles and sentencing him to death. But here's where things get strange. Unlike most nobles condemned for treason, George wasn't executed in public. His death happened privately, within the Tower of London. No official record details how, but almost immediately rumors began to circulate. Rumors that he was given a final indulgence, perhaps as a twisted gesture of royal courtesy, to choose his method of execution. And so, according to several chroniclers, George opted to drown in a butt of Malmsey wine, a 126-gallon barrel of sweet Madeira-style liquor. Whether it was mercy, mockery, or metaphor, no one can say for sure. But the story stuck. The image of a duke, traitor, brother, wine lover, sinking beneath the surface of his favorite drink was too potent for history to forget. Some historians doubt it. Others suspect it was symbolic, shorthand for a less picturesque end. But the symbolism is undeniable. A man undone by his own thirst, for power, for recognition, and perhaps for the very drink that would become his tomb. Still, as far as bizarre royal exits go, George's wine-soaked demise is almost poetic. Which is more than can be said for the next king, whose post-mortem journey involved a coffin that couldn't quite hold him, and a stray dog that didn't know the rules about respecting the dead. 16. King Henry VIII, bursting coffin. If ever there were a monarch whose legacy couldn't be contained, it was King Henry VIII, a man whose appetite for power, wives, food, and control left a permanent scar on British history. He broke with the Pope, established the Church of England, dissolved monasteries, and married 6 times, leaving behind a trail of decapitated spouses, rewritten doctrines, and architectural wreckage. So perhaps it's only fitting that, in the end, even his coffin refused to hold him. Henry died in 1547 at the age of 55, though he felt much older. His health had declined dramatically in his later years. Once a golden young prince, athletic and charismatic, he had become a bloated, immobile ruler plagued by chronic leg ulcers, gout, and other complications. Even walking was a struggle. His court revolved around his moods, which swung between paranoia and indulgence. His final years were consumed with securing his lineage, maintaining his grip on power, and, increasingly, managing the decline of the very body that had once symbolized Tudor strength. But as imposing as Henry had once been, death was unimpressed. When he finally succumbed, likely to complications from diabetes, infections, or heart failure, his body was embalmed and placed in a massive coffin to be transported to Windsor for burial. The journey was slow. England in January is not forgiving to the dead, and Tudor embalming practices were more art than science. With each passing hour, the body inside became less cooperative. According to chroniclers, particularly those with a flair for poetic justice, the coffin was temporarily housed at Sion Abbey, a former convent Henry had once dissolved. During the overnight stay, something disturbing happened. The coffin began to leak. The story goes that the king's remains seeped out through cracks in the poorly sealed case, leaving a trail on the floor of the abbey. A dog, reportedly wandering nearby, lapped at the mess. Now, this tale has been debated. Some say it's apocryphal, Protestant propaganda, or poetic Catholic revenge. But even if it's exaggerated, it still captures the uneasy truth of Henry's final act. A man who tried to control everything in life, including God, lost control in death. His carefully curated image, immortalized in portraits and politics, ended not with royal fanfare, but with a slow, undignified decline and a funeral procession plagued by the limits of human containment. Henry was eventually buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, next to his third wife, Jane Seymour, the only one who gave him the son he so desperately wanted. There was no grand monument, no gilded sarcophagus, just a simple slab. The man who altered England's religious landscape with a signature now lies beneath stone, unnamed, quietly decaying in historical irony. And perhaps that's the real lesson. No matter how much land you own, how many laws you rewrite, or how many wives you dismiss, the body still wins. Gravity, time, and nature don't bend to crowns. Still, for all of Henry's final indignity, at least he made it to his funeral. The next king on our list wasn't granted that closure. In fact, his death became an image so precise, so strange, it was immortalized not in stone, but in the corner of a medieval tapestry, with an arrow right through the eye. 17. King Harold II. Arrow in the eye. Few deaths in British history are as vividly, obsessively, or questionably remembered as that of King Harold II, the last crowned Anglo-Saxon king of England. His reign lasted just 9 months, but his demise, allegedly via an arrow to the eye at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, has become one of the most famous and symbolically rich endings in medieval lore. Whether it's entirely accurate is still debated, but the image endures. A fallen king, felled by fate, hubris, and one exceptionally well-placed shot. Harold Godwinson wasn't born into royalty. He was a powerful nobleman, Earl of Wessex, and one of the most influential men in England under King Edward the Confessor. When Edward died without a direct heir, Harold was swiftly crowned king, backed by the English nobility and the Witenagemot, the Council of Powerful Lords. But there was one problem, or actually, 3. Harold had enemies, big ones. First, there was Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, who claimed the English throne through a convoluted web of dynastic promises. He invaded the north with a Viking army. Harold rushed up, defeated him at the brutal Battle of Stamford Bridge, and looked, briefly, like a heroic national defender. Then came William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed that Harold had once sworn, on holy relics no less, to support William's own claim to the English crown. When Harold took the crown for himself, William took that personally, and politically, and militarily. Within weeks of his victory in the north, Harold had to force march his exhausted army south to meet William's invading force, landing on the Sussex coast. On October 14, 1066, the two sides clashed at the Battle of Hastings, a brutal all-day fight involving infantry, cavalry, and hours of strategic seesawing. By sunset, Harold was dead, and so was Anglo-Saxon England. According to the famous Bayeux Tapestry, a long embroidered scroll that tells William's version of the conquest, Harold died from an arrow to the eye. The scene is unmistakable. A figure marked Harold is shown clutching his face as an arrow strikes. It's dramatic, efficient, and symbolically perfect. The proud usurper struck down by divine judgment, blinded for his broken oath. But historians have long debated the truth of that image. Some suggest Harold was actually cut down by Norman knights in the final moments of the battle. Others think the arrow scene was added later to emphasize the idea of punishment from heaven. Either way, the arrow in the eye story stuck. It's visually iconic, narratively convenient, and just absurd enough to endure. A king brought down by a moment of cosmic precision, too good to fact-check. And so Harold became the last Anglo-Saxon king, his death marking the end of a native English dynasty and the beginning of Norman rule. It was the last time England was successfully invaded, and the first time a death would be remembered not by bones or tombs, but by thread and legend. But if Harold's end was embroidered into history, the next king's death feels like something out of a tragicomedy, an assassin's escape foiled not by guards or gods, but by a missing sewer grate, and the king's own tennis balls. 18. King James I of Scotland. Stuck in a sewer. Few royal deaths are quite as ironic, or as frustratingly metaphorical, as that of King James I of Scotland, a man who spent most of his reign trying to close loopholes in the kingdom, only to die because of a literal one. His story reads like the script of a Shakespearean tragedy rewritten by a satirist. Betrayal, revenge, and a sewer tunnel that refused to cooperate at the worst possible moment. James I ruled Scotland from 1406 to 1437, though the first 18 years of his reign were spent not in Edinburgh, but as a political hostage in England. He was captured by English pirates at the age of 12 while trying to flee to France, and held by King Henry IV and then Henry V, who kept him as a very polite kind of prisoner. Well-educated, well-treated, but effectively neutralized. While in captivity, his father died, making him King of Scots in name, but not in action. Eventually, he was ransomed and returned to Scotland at age 30. And when he arrived, he wasn't interested in being a ceremonial king. He came back ready to govern, and not kindly. James set about centralizing power, curbing the nobility, restoring the monarchy's finances, and asserting authority in a land long ruled by overmighty lords and regional warlords. He was intelligent, literate, and reform-minded. Also paranoid, and for good reason. The nobles didn't like him, especially not the Black Douglases, the most powerful family in Scotland at the time. They saw James's reforms not as improvements but as threats to their wealth and autonomy. Tensions mounted. James cracked down harder. Eventually, his reforms made him too dangerous for the old families to tolerate, and so they plotted. On the night of February 20th, 1437, James was staying at the Blackfriars Monastery in Perth. The royal residence was meant to be secure, but one of his servants, coincidentally a co-conspirator, left the door to the king's quarters open. Assassins entered, armed and ready. James, realizing what was happening, attempted to flee. He made a dash for the privy chamber and tried to escape through the sewer tunnel beneath the building, a narrow passage that once served as a discreet escape route for emergencies exactly like this. It should have worked. It would have worked. Except James had recently ordered the tunnel's exit sealed off, frustrated that servants kept losing tennis balls down it. Yes, tennis balls. And so when James tried to flee through the passage, he found himself cornered, trapped. There was no way out. The assassins found him and killed him on the spot. The symbolism of it all would be heavy-handed if it weren't absolutely true. A king who spent years plugging up the chaos of a fractured kingdom, done in by a decision to literally plug up a hole, one made for a trivial, almost comic reason. His death sparked outrage and ultimately led to the downfall of his killers. But the message was clear. In a kingdom of vendettas and grudges, even the smartest king can be undone by the smallest oversight. And while James's death was a lesson in fatal design flaws, the next monarch on our list supposedly met his end not through conspiracy or cruelty, but something far more abstract, a broken heart, or so the official record would kindly suggest. 19. King Henry VI died of melancholy. In the long, blood-soaked saga of the Wars of the Roses, a conflict so tangled it could give a historian vertigo, King Henry VI stands out not as a warrior or a schemer, but as a man almost completely unsuited for the violent, cynical world he inherited. A king whose crown weighed too heavily, whose spirit seemed perpetually dimmed, and whose final chapter was written not in fire or fury, but in silence, confusion, and one of the strangest royal death explanations ever penned: melancholy. Henry became King of England in 1422 at just 9 months old, following the death of his legendary father Henry V, hero of Agincourt, conqueror of northern France, and national icon. That kind of legacy is difficult to live up to under any circumstances. For Henry VI, it was impossible. He wasn't his father's son in temperament or style. He was quiet, bookish, intensely pious, and deeply uninterested in warfare or statecraft. In another life, he might have made a fine monk. Instead, he was made a monarch. The early years of his reign were ruled by regents, but when Henry came of age, it became quickly and tragically clear that he lacked the decisiveness and charisma needed to hold the throne, especially during a time when the kingdom was slipping out of control. France, which his father had nearly conquered, was rapidly falling away. At home, the nobility grew restless. Factions hardened. And eventually, battle lines were drawn between the House of Lancaster, Henry's side, and the House of York, led by Richard, Duke of York, and his descendants. Through it all, Henry vacillated. He collapsed mentally in 1453, possibly catatonic for over a year, only to recover and sink again. He was intermittently removed from power, restored, and removed again. He was king in name, but rarely in practice. At one point, during Edward IV's initial reign, Henry was found hiding in a rural abbey, disheveled and muttering prayers, less a monarch than a man lost in his own thoughts. In 1470, Henry was briefly restored to the throne in a political shake-up orchestrated by Warwick the Kingmaker. But it didn't last. Within months, Edward IV reclaimed power. Henry, now a prisoner in the Tower of London, became a liability, an ex-king with a claim, a name, and just enough loyalists to make things inconvenient. Then, on the night of May 21st, 1471, Henry died. The official explanation? He died of melancholy. In modern terms, perhaps a heart attack brought on by stress. But almost no one believed that. Not then, not now. His only son had been killed in battle just weeks earlier. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, was imprisoned. His world had collapsed, and his captor, Edward IV, had no reason to keep him alive. Rumors swirled that Henry had been murdered, most likely smothered, on the direct orders of Edward or his brother Richard, the future Richard III. The timing was too clean, the motive too obvious, but the story stuck. A king so crushed by life that his body simply gave out. It's a fittingly eerie footnote to a reign defined by passivity and loss. Henry VI, the king who never wanted the crown, became the only English monarch canonized by the Church, though unofficially. Not for valor or wisdom, but for suffering. And yet, as softly as he slipped away, the next royal departure is anything but subdued. It's a flash of fire in the sky, a roar of engines, and the tragic end of a prince who crashed back to earth chasing the thrill he couldn't resist. 20. Prince William of Gloucester. Plane stunt crash. Among the many tragic footnotes in modern royal history, Prince William of Gloucester is one of the most quietly haunting. A royal who lived just far enough from the throne to flirt with danger, and just close enough to monarchy to be remembered, if not always understood. His death didn't come in battle or scandal, but in the sky, a brief, brilliant crash of ambition, freedom, and fire. Born in 1941, Prince William was the eldest son of the Duke of Gloucester, making him a cousin to Queen Elizabeth II and eighth in line to the throne at the time of his birth. He was everything the tabloids like to call dashing, tall, handsome, well-educated at Cambridge and Stanford, and fluent in several languages. But unlike many royals of his generation, William was restless, independent, and disinterested in the ceremonial grind of monarchy. He preferred wilderness to ballrooms, motorcycles to carriages, and most of all, airplanes. William had a passion for flying that bordered on obsession. Not content with being chauffeured or piloted by someone else, he became a trained and certified pilot, regularly flying light aircraft himself. While serving in a diplomatic post in Lagos, Nigeria, he would often fly over jungle landscapes for fun. He wasn't reckless, just adventurous in a way that didn't quite fit the mold of royal tradition. He wanted life unscripted. But it wasn't just aviation that set him apart. Prince William had reportedly fallen in love with Zsuzsa Starkloff, a Hungarian-born former model and divorcee. In another life, she might have become his wife. But within the royal framework of the 1960s and 70s, she was considered complicated. Their relationship was serious, but under the pressures of protocol, William never proposed. Friends said he was torn between duty and desire, between family expectation and the kind of life that might have been his, had he been born just a few branches further down the royal tree. In 1972, while preparing for a major role in royal life due to his father's declining health, William entered an amateur air race near Wolverhampton. It wasn't his first race, but this one had more at stake. He was flying a Piper Cherokee Arrow, a sleek single-engine plane known for its speed and sensitivity. During takeoff for the race's second lap, his aircraft veered sharply, lost altitude, and crashed into a nearby field. The plane exploded. William was 31 years old. The only other passenger, his co-pilot and instructor, also died. The investigation suggested pilot error or mechanical failure, but no definitive cause was identified. The royal family grieved in public silence. Zsuzsa Starkloff, who had watched the crash from the airfield, was never publicly acknowledged in the mourning. Prince William's death was devastating in its suddenness and symbolism. Here was a royal who seemed to balance modernity and monarchy, tradition and thrill, and, yet in one instant, all of that ended in smoke and fire. He was a prince who didn't want to be bound by titles, but the tragedy was that freedom came at the cost of permanence. And while William's end was airborne, the next royal on our list met his fate not in the sky, but in the trenches of World War I, charging forward with aristocratic pride into the very heart of modern warfare, only to be blown away by a shell that didn't care about bloodlines. 21. Prince Maurice of Battenberg, charging into shellfire. By the time Prince Maurice of Battenberg died in 1914, the romantic image of royal nobility charging into battle had already begun to crumble. The old world of sabers and banners was being swallowed by something far more mechanical, more impersonal, and infinitely more deadly: the First World War. Maurice's death, one of the earliest in the conflict, didn't just mark the fall of a young prince. It marked the end of a certain kind of royal mythology. And it happened with all the indifference that modern warfare tends to bring. Born in 1891, Prince Maurice was the youngest son of Prince Henry of Battenberg and Princess Beatrice, Queen Victoria's youngest daughter. This made him both a grandson of the Queen and a member of the broader European tangle of dynastic families, half German, fully British, and never far from the expectations that came with the name Battenberg. He was bright, athletic, and by all accounts, personable. He trained at Wellington College and later joined the King's Royal Rifle Corps, a prestigious regiment with deep ties to the aristocracy. At the outbreak of World War I, Maurice was serving as a lieutenant. He could have stayed back, taken a desk post, or let others handle the front lines. But he didn't. Like many young officers of his rank and background, Maurice volunteered for frontline service, eager to lead, eager to prove something. Perhaps to his family, perhaps to himself, or perhaps to a romantic idea of what royal duty looked like in wartime. But World War I was no place for heroics. In October 1914, British forces were engaged in the First Battle of Ypres, a brutal clash in the early stages of the war. It was a landscape of shattered fields, tangled wire, and mud that swallowed men whole. The old ideas of cavalry charges and glorious last stands didn't apply here. The new weapons, machine guns, long-range artillery, and high-explosive shells rewrote every rule of combat. On October 27th, Maurice was leading his men near Zonnebeke, in Belgium, when a German artillery shell exploded nearby. He was killed instantly. The report was brief, the details few. There was no dramatic duel, no final words, Just a blast, a name, and another casualty added to the rapidly growing lists. A grandson of Queen Victoria, gone before most of Britain even realized he was there. His death was met with genuine grief in royal circles, but also a kind of somber acceptance. Maurice wasn't the only aristocrat to die that week. Dozens of young nobles, many of them junior officers, were being cut down at similar rates. The war didn't discriminate. Blue blood didn't buy you extra seconds. There's something quietly haunting about his end. A man raised in privilege, educated for leadership, trained for honor, blown apart not in some daring act, but by a faceless weapon, in a field of thousands just like him. He was buried in Belgium, far from his royal roots, and his story became one of the many eclipsed by the war's relentless scale. But his death serves as a strange bookmark, one of the last royals to fall in the old-fashioned way, sword metaphorically in hand, walking upright into a world that had already decided to burn everything down. And while Maurice died in the chaos of war, the next king met his end under far quieter circumstances, face to face with a statue and a booby trap no one saw coming. 22. King Malcolm II of Scotland, assassinated by booby trap. By the time King Malcolm II of Scotland met his end in 1034, he had outlived his enemies, rewritten his dynasty, and clawed his way to a throne that had a habit of eating its occupants alive. He had ruled for decades, fought off Vikings, rival clans, and the occasional opportunistic noble. But in the end, it wasn't a battlefield or rebellion that claimed him. It was a statue. Or so the story goes. Malcolm II was the last of the House of Alpin, and his reign marked a transitional period in early Scottish history. He was a shrewd ruler, focused less on poetic ideals of kingship and more on power consolidation, territorial, dynastic, and military. He expanded Scotland's influence through a combination of warfare and strategic marriage alliances. It was under Malcolm's rule that the foundations were laid for what would later become a more unified Scottish monarchy. But with power came paranoia. Malcolm's early rule was marked by violence, much of it aimed at securing the succession for his daughter's son Duncan. Yes, that Duncan, later dramatized, poorly and briefly, in Shakespeare's Macbeth. To achieve that, Malcolm allegedly eliminated any rival who could lay a claim to the throne. He didn't have a direct male heir, so he restructured the traditional succession laws to favor his grandson, a bold move, and one that made enemies. By 1034, Malcolm was in his early 80s, an exceptional age for the time. Most kings didn't live long enough to worry about legacy, but Malcolm did, and he worried a lot. He had seen enough conspiracies to know that one more might be waiting around the corner. What he didn't know was that this one would be waiting in plain sight. According to chroniclers, writing decades later and with varying degrees of flair, Malcolm was assassinated by a booby-trapped statue. The details are murky, as they always are in legends that come with just a touch of theatricality. The story goes that during a visit to a remote location, possibly in the region of Glamis, he was lured to touch or examine a statue, perhaps out of curiosity or ritual. Hidden within it was a concealed blade or dagger triggered by the king's contact. The trap worked. Malcolm was mortally wounded and died shortly afterward, marking the end of an era. It was a death that would make more sense in a spy novel than a medieval chronicle. A king brought down not by army or sword, but by a cleverly placed killing device. The symbolism practically writes itself. After a lifetime of removing rivals, he was outmaneuvered not by ambition, but by ingenuity. Was it true? Historians have their doubts. The tale may have been embroidered or entirely fabricated to dramatize an otherwise mundane royal death. But the legend stuck precisely because it fit Malcolm's story. A paranoid king surrounded by plots, finally undone by the one he didn't see coming. His death paved the way for Duncan's succession and, in turn, the rise of Macbeth. Not the cursed play, but the real man who would take Duncan's throne soon after. But if Malcolm's death feels like something out of a murder mystery, the next prince's fate veers into full absurdist territory. a nobleman allegedly undone by something as small and deadly as a cherry stone. 23. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, choked on a cherry pit. In the grand theater of royal demise, some deaths arrive with trumpets and conspiracies, others with slow fades into illness and age. And then there's the case of Prince Frederick, Duke of York and Albany, the second son of King George III, whose alleged cause of death reads less like history and more like the punchline to a particularly cruel joke: choked on a cherry stone. Born in 1763, Frederick was raised with all the pomp and privilege expected of a royal son. He was groomed for greatness, though the throne was never meant for him. That job went to his older brother, the future King George IV, a man whose reign would be defined by indulgence, debt, and waste-expanding scandals. By contrast, Frederick was dutiful, serious, and occasionally mocked for being a bit too stiff in both personality and posture. But if he lacked charisma, he made up for it with rank. At just 17, he was made a bishop, and soon after appointed commander-in-chief of the British Army, a position he held for decades. Despite having no record as a particularly brilliant field commander, he's remembered for implementing crucial reforms in the British military, especially after the embarrassing failures during the French Revolutionary Wars. He professionalized officer training, introduced merit-based promotions, and helped shape the army that would later stand firm at Waterloo. In short, he was more competent than colorful. Which brings us to his death in 1827. Official records state that Prince Frederick died of dropsy, an old-fashioned term for edema likely caused by kidney or heart failure. He'd been ill for some time, increasingly withdrawn from public life. That explanation is dull, medical, and plausible. But it's not the version people remember. According to persistent rumor, the Duke of York died in an altogether more embarrassing fashion. He choked on a cherry pit, one careless bite, one stray stone, and the second highest ranking royal in the kingdom is reduced to a cautionary tale about eating too quickly. There's no contemporary evidence to confirm this story. It likely emerged as gossip or satire, perhaps tied to the public's growing impatience with the royal family's endless privileges and detached lifestyle. Yet the rumor stuck because, in its absurdity, it captured something about Frederick, a man who always tried to do the right thing, but never quite escaped being the second choice. Second son, second best, second to none in the army, but never first in the public's imagination. The cherry pit story is less about fact and more about folklore, a little dig at the idea that power protects. Because here, even royalty could be undone not by war or scandal, but by fruit. And yet, as ridiculous as a cherry stone may seem, it wasn't the first time royal intestines would be the subject of national concern. The next queen on our list, strong-willed and sharp-tongued, faced a far more gruesome fate in the name of medicine, dying not from her ailments, but from the very hands that tried to save her. 24. Queen Caroline of Ansbach, embarrassing surgery. Royalty has a long tradition of being treated by the best physicians money and power can summon. Unfortunately, in the 18th century, that didn't always mean they knew what they were doing. In the case of Queen Caroline of Ansbach, wife of King George II, her final chapter is a story, not of war, scandal, or assassination, but of medical overconfidence, bad timing, and a queen who managed to maintain her wit and composure, even as her doctors quite literally cut her open and made everything worse. Caroline of Ansbach was not your average consort. She was highly educated, politically savvy, and widely regarded as one of the sharpest minds at the Georgian court. Behind the scenes, she played a significant role in shaping British politics, advising ministers, smoothing over her husband's many temperamental outbursts, and serving as the real glue holding the Hanoverian monarchy together during its early, uneasy years. She was clever, calm under pressure, and respected by those who understood how much work she did to make her husband look competent. By 1737, however, Caroline's health began to falter. What started as abdominal discomfort escalated quickly into something far more serious. Physicians soon diagnosed her with an intestinal hernia, a condition that, even today, requires careful surgical intervention. But in 18th century Britain, surgery was closer to guesswork than science, performed without anesthesia, in unsanitary conditions, and based largely on anatomical theories that were often more philosophical than factual. Still, Caroline, ever the stoic, agreed to the procedure. What happened next was, tragically, a combination of urgency and incompetence. The royal physicians performed multiple operations, hoping to relieve her symptoms. During one of them, they accidentally punctured her bowel, a catastrophic mistake. Infection set in rapidly. Caroline, in immense pain, endured it with a level of grace that astonished even her critics. And then she did something uniquely Caroline. She made jokes. As her condition deteriorated and death became inevitable, Caroline reportedly remained sharp, even teasing her husband in her final days. George II, uncharacteristically emotional, told her he couldn't live without her. Her dry response? "You will, George." He did, for another 23 years. Caroline died on November 20th, 1737, after 8 agonizing days. The court went into mourning, but the grief was tinged with awkwardness. Everyone knew that her death hadn't been necessary. Not entirely. If anything, it was a result of flawed judgment by the very doctors assigned to protect her life. And yet, no inquiries were made. No heads rolled. Royal physicians remained royal physicians. History remembered Caroline kindly, as a wise and capable queen who endured much in private while guiding a volatile monarchy in public. But her death stands as a grim reminder of the limits of privilege. All the titles, jewels, and influence in the world couldn't protect her from a scalpel wielded in uncertainty. Still, at least Caroline was mourned. The next king on our list died not surrounded by family or honored by ceremony, but alone and unexpectedly, still clutching the title of unready, even at the very end. 25. King Ethelred the Unready. Death by bad timing. If names were fate, then King Ethelred the Unready never stood a chance. Even centuries later, his unfortunate epithet sticks like medieval chewing gum to his reputation. Comic, tragic, and vaguely accusatory. Though often misunderstood, unready didn't mean unprepared in the modern sense. It came from the Old English unrad, meaning poor counsel or ill-advised. So he wasn't clueless, just cursed with terrible timing, even worse advisors, and a kingdom perpetually on the brink of collapse. Fittingly, his death would follow the same pattern. No dramatic battle, no grand betrayal, just a monarch who, true to form, exited the world with all the decisive flair of a man who missed the moment once again. Ethelred ruled England from 978 to 1016, though that tidy time frame is deceptive. His reign was marked by 2 coronations, 1 exile, and a kingdom teetering between Viking invasion and administrative exhaustion. He ascended the throne as a child after the violent death of his half-brother Edward the Martyr, an event that cast a long and suspicious shadow. From the start, Ethelred's reign was marred by political instability and the rising threat of Danish incursions. He spent much of his rule buying off Viking raiders with heavy payments known as Danegeld, a strategy that worked precisely long enough for the invaders to realize they could simply keep coming back for more. When brute force failed, Ethelred tried diplomacy. When diplomacy failed, he tried desperate violence, such as the infamous St. Brice's Day massacre in 1002, when he ordered the killing of Danish settlers throughout England. Far from securing peace, it provoked a far more devastating response: the full-scale invasion of England by Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark. By 1013, Ethelred had lost his throne and fled to Normandy. For a moment, it looked like the end of the Anglo-Saxon line. But Sweyn died suddenly the next year, and Ethelred was invited back, not so much out of loyalty as out of sheer lack of better options. It was a rare second chance, and true to his name, he made little of it. More invasions followed. His son Edmund Ironside rose to prominence as a military leader, but Ethelred himself faded from view, increasingly irrelevant as younger, more energetic figures took the lead. Then, in April 1016, at the height of another Danish campaign, this time led by Canute the Great, Ethelred died. The records are frustratingly vague. Most simply state that he died of illness, on the toilet or in his bed. There was no noble sacrifice, no public farewell. Just an elderly king, tired and ailing, slipping away while his country once again unraveled into civil war. Even in death, Ethelred couldn't catch a break. His passing cleared the way for Edmund Ironside to become king, briefly, before dying later that same year in another highly suspicious episode. But that's its own mystery. For Ethelred, his death was the final punctuation mark on a life defined by indecision, missed opportunities, and a legacy no PR campaign could ever fix. And as understated as his end was, the next royal death would be anything but quiet. Because the next tragedy unfolds in the nursery room of empire. A royal birth turned national catastrophe, as Britain lost not just a princess, but an entire future in one night. 26. Princess Charlotte, doctor's overconfidence. Royal births are supposed to be triumphs, welcomed with bells, banquets, and brass bands. But in 1817, what should have been a celebration became a national trauma. Princess Charlotte of Wales, the only legitimate grandchild of King George III, and the great hope of a fractured monarchy, died in childbirth at the age of 21, not from some unstoppable illness, but from a perfect storm of medical misjudgment, political pressure, and deadly professional arrogance. Charlotte was not just a princess. She was the princess. The only child of George, Prince of Wales, later George IV, she was the lone legitimate heir of her generation, a shining star amid the scandal-stained skies of the Georgian court. England, sick of the excesses and infidelities of her father, adored her. She was spirited, intelligent, and had something few royals in her lineage possessed: public sympathy. Her marriage to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, the future King of Belgium, in 1816, was a moment of rare royal optimism. The union was a genuine love match, remarkable in a time when royal weddings were usually as romantic as trade agreements. Their happiness, along with Charlotte's popularity, gave the public something they desperately wanted: a glimpse of a stable royal future. So when Charlotte became pregnant in 1817, the entire nation held its breath. Newspapers followed her condition. Markets issued commemorative plates. The country anticipated a royal birth that would secure the monarchy and perhaps even soothe the chaos of the Napoleonic era's aftermath. But what unfolded was something else entirely. Charlotte's physician, Sir Richard Croft, was part of a respected but deeply conservative wing of British medicine. He subscribed to a method known as the English art of midwifery, which favored minimal intervention and a strong belief in letting nature take its course. Unfortunately, nature in this case was not cooperating. Charlotte went into labor on November 3, 1817. The labor was long, excruciatingly long, lasting more than 50 hours. Croft refused to use forceps, a relatively new but increasingly common tool in continental Europe. He also refused to summon more experienced surgeons until it was too late. By the time the child was finally delivered, a stillborn boy, Charlotte was weak, exhausted, and hemorrhaging. She died early the next morning. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Britain descended into mourning. Shops closed. Streets fell silent. Even hardened political cartoonists, who had spent years mocking the royal family, held back. It wasn't just the loss of a princess. It was the loss of everything she represented: hope, stability, and the promise of a new kind of monarchy. As for Croft, the grief, guilt, and public backlash consumed him. Less than 3 months later, he died by his own hand while overseeing another royal birth. His suicide note was never found, but the cause was unmistakable. The weight of a preventable royal tragedy. Charlotte's death triggered a dynastic scramble. With no heirs in the next generation, George III's aging sons suddenly began rushing into marriages, desperate to produce the next legitimate royal baby. Out of this panic came a child named Victoria, who would grow up to rule an empire. But before Victoria, the crown passed through darker hands. Because the next royal death isn't just a mystery. It's an unsolved disappearance inside stone walls, a vanishing act that's haunted the Tower of London ever since. 27. King Edward V. Disappeared in the Tower. There are royal deaths, and then there are royal vanishings. Episodes so cloaked in silence and shadow that they refuse to be confined to any one version of history. The story of King Edward V, a boy of just 12 years old, is not a tale of battle, illness, or misadventure. It is something far stranger, a slow erasure. A royal disappearance so cleanly executed and so stubbornly unresolved that it remains one of Britain's most persistent and unsettling mysteries. Edward was the eldest son of King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, born into the swirling chaos of the Wars of the Roses. As a child, he was intelligent, well-spoken, and precociously aware of his royal role. His future seemed all but assured, until his father died suddenly in April 1483, thrusting young Edward onto the throne and into the crosshairs of power-hungry factions before he had even grasped the full meaning of kingship. He was proclaimed king almost immediately, but a coronation never happened. The real trouble began with his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was named Lord Protector until Edward came of age, a move that might have made sense in theory, but quickly transformed into something else entirely. Under the pretense of protecting the new king, Richard seized custody of Edward, moved him into the Tower of London, and gradually isolated him from his allies, his mother, and even his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury. At first, the Tower wasn't a prison. It was a traditional royal residence, often used as a safe place to house monarchs before coronation. But the coronation never came. Within weeks, Richard declared that Edward and his brother were illegitimate, supposedly because Edward IV had contracted a secret marriage before marrying Elizabeth Woodville, making all their children technically bastards. Parliament ratified this claim in the document known as Titulus Regius, and Richard took the crown for himself, becoming Richard III. The two young princes remained in the Tower, and then they were gone. No body, no announcement, no trial, no public fallout. They simply vanished sometime in the summer of 1483. Guards were dismissed, servants rotated, and chroniclers began to whisper. Some claimed they were smothered in their sleep. Others said they were taken away in secret. A few even floated conspiracy theories involving foreign plots or escape. But the most accepted and haunting version is the simplest, that the boys were quietly murdered in the Tower to eliminate any threat to Richard's claim. Decades later, in 1674, workers renovating part of the Tower found a small wooden box buried beneath a staircase. Inside were the skeletal remains of two children, roughly the ages of the missing princes. The bones were interred in Westminster Abbey, identified, in the loosest possible terms, as Edward and his brother. But no formal identification was ever made. Even modern forensic analysis has been politely avoided, perhaps out of tradition, or perhaps out of fear of what might be confirmed or disproved. Edward V remains officially listed as one of the shortest reigning monarchs in English history. No coronation, no funeral, no justice. Just a boy who stepped into the crown and was swiftly swallowed by it. And if one vanishing royal isn't chilling enough, the next death on our list is a duplicate in tragedy. His younger brother Richard, who disappeared beside him in silence, but left behind echoes that have never stopped stirring the stones of the Tower. 28. Prince Richard of Shrewsbury, the other Tower boy. If King Edward V is remembered as the boy who lost a kingdom before he could wear the crown, then Prince Richard of Shrewsbury, his younger brother, is remembered as the echo that followed him into silence. Where Edward was a king in name, Richard was a prince by proximity. A child who became collateral in a story much bigger than himself, one he had no chance of escaping. Together the two brothers are known as the princes in the Tower, though it's not entirely clear whether they ever left it alive. Richard was born in 1473, the second son of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. His birth should have secured the dynasty's future, a spare to his brother's heir. He was given the title Duke of York, and at age 4 was married by proxy to Anne de Mowbray, a child heiress with a vast inheritance. The political machinery around him was already in motion long before he could understand it. His destiny, like most royal children, had been written by adults in ink, titles, and treaties. In 1483, after his father's sudden death, Richard's life took a decisive turn. He was summoned to join his brother Edward, now technically King Edward V, at the Tower of London, where preparations were supposedly underway for Edward's coronation. Richard was 10. The two brothers were housed together. They were seen occasionally playing in the gardens or watching from the windows. And then, they weren't. After the summer of 1483, no one saw them again. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, declared the boys illegitimate and took the throne as Richard III. His claim rested on an alleged pre-contract of marriage involving Edward IV, an accusation that, if true, would render his nephews ineligible to inherit the crown. Parliament gave its approval. The boys disappeared, and everyone looked the other way. Prince Richard, like his older brother, left no final words, no known remains, no public farewell. Only rumors. Some said the boys had been smothered in their sleep. Others blamed Richard III directly. A few suggested they had been secretly spirited away, possibly raised in hiding. Centuries later, the idea that one of the princes survived inspired impostors, most famously Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard and led a rebellion against Henry VII. But the claim was never proven, and Warbeck was eventually executed. In 1674, when two small skeletons were discovered beneath a stairwell in the tower, they were assumed to be the princes. The bones were reburied in Westminster Abbey under a solemn, anonymous tomb that still draws visitors and debate. Modern forensic testing has never been conclusively allowed, possibly out of tradition, possibly out of royal discomfort. The mystery, like the tower itself, remains sealed. What makes Richard's death especially haunting is that he was never really known. He had no reign, no public voice, no role outside his brothers. His entire historical footprint is as someone else's shadow. A boy defined by his disappearance, by what people feared had happened, and by the silence that followed. If Edward was the fallen heir, Richard was the forgotten one. And yet, in the fog of confusion and overlapping stories, another royal Richard emerges, this time not a boy, but a Henry. A historical misprint, a name tangled in confusion. A man who may not have even existed as claimed, but who, according to old scribes, somehow managed to die multiple times, without ever quite being sure which Henry he was. 29. King Henry VI of Scotland. The fictional overlap. In the well-worn pages of medieval chronicles, where fact often flirts with fiction and confusion reigns supreme, there's a peculiar ghost in the royal ledger, King Henry VI of Scotland, a monarch who, according to some historical misfires, may have died multiple times across multiple kingdoms, all while never technically existing in the first place. Yes, you read that correctly. There has never been a Henry VI of Scotland. And yet, he shows up, frequently, in 17th and 18th century texts, footnotes, family trees, and amateur histories, as if he were a real, tragic, flesh and blood king. Chroniclers sometimes confused him with the actual Henry VI of England, the pious and mentally fragile monarch who was deposed during the Wars of the Roses, and whom we met earlier in this series. Others seem to have conjured him entirely, mixing up names, dates, and royal lineages with the enthusiasm of someone assembling a jigsaw puzzle in the dark. The result? A phantom monarch. In some of these errant records, this non-existent Henry VI of Scotland dies nobly in battle. In others, he perishes in exile, poisoned by political rivals. A few accounts claim he was a child king overthrown by a usurper, always unnamed, always suspicious. The details shift, mutate, and contradict each other, but they keep showing up. It's as though history, already packed with brutal battles, unfortunate toilets, and exploding monarchs, decided to sprinkle in an entirely fictional royal death just for the flavor. But how did this happen? The confusion likely stems from a perfect storm of overlapping dynasties, reused royal names, and inconsistent scribal practices. The English and Scottish monarchies, though distinct, often shared names, James's, Edward's, and Henry's in particular. Add in the frequent cross-border marriages, treaties, and betrayals, and it's not hard to see how someone, somewhere, might have assumed that Scotland must have had a Henry VI tucked in there somewhere. It didn't help that Henry VI of England spent parts of his troubled reign engaged with Scottish affairs, retreating north during times of political upheaval, aligning with Scottish nobles, and briefly being held in the borderlands. For less detail-oriented chroniclers, or the occasional agenda-driven pamphleteer, this was enough to blur national boundaries and assign him a second crown he never wore. And so, over time, the myth calcified. A Scottish king named Henry VI who, depending on which errant manuscript you consult, died tragically, mysteriously, or symbolically, often with all the melodrama of a Shakespearean subplot and none of the fact-checking. This isn't just a clerical error. It's a bizarre reminder of how history can manufacture ghosts out of paperwork, how monarchs can be created posthumously, not by coronation or conquest, but by someone's bad handwriting. And perhaps that's the strangest royal death of all. Not the messy end of a real king, but the imagined demise of a monarch who never lived, yet still managed to die, repeatedly, in the margins of historical imagination. But if mistaken identities and scribal errors can fabricate a monarch, the next royal death is very real, very bloody, and shockingly intimate. A family feud taken to lethal extremes at a dinner table in medieval Wales. 30. King Owain, Gwyned's sons, death by family feud. In the highlands and hearths of 12th century Wales, royal drama didn't always come from foreign invasions or courtly intrigue. Sometimes it arrived over the dinner table. In the case of King Owain Gwyned's sons, the stage was not a battlefield or a throne room, but a domestic setting, a meal shared among siblings that turned from tense to terminal in what can only be described as one of the most absurdly domestic royal deaths in British history. Owain Gwynedd, who ruled from around 1137 until his death in 1170, was one of the most powerful and respected Welsh kings of the medieval period. He defended his kingdom of Gwynedd against both Norman incursions and English kings with a mix of military strength and political cunning. He was widely considered the first to carry the title Prince of Wales in any serious political sense. But for all his strength as a ruler, Owain's personal life was a tangle of romantic entanglements and dynastic chaos. He fathered at least 13 sons, possibly more, with various wives and mistresses. Some were legitimate, many were not. And all of them, regardless of birth status, seemed to believe they had a valid claim to his throne. The result was a pressure cooker of sibling rivalry, political maneuvering, and bad blood stewing in the halls of royal palaces and mountain fortresses. After Owain's death in 1170, the succession was, as expected, a disaster. Instead of a single agreed-upon heir, multiple sons jostled for power, splitting the kingdom into a collection of factions. Alliances were made, then broken. Brothers turned on brothers, some exiling each other, others going further. And then came the dinner. According to various accounts, some semi-historical, others suspiciously poetic, 2 of Owain's sons were killed during an argument at a family feast. The specifics are, as usual with medieval chronicles, murky. Some versions say the quarrel started over succession rights. Others say it was about land. One version, perhaps apocryphal but undeniably vivid, claims the entire thing began over a dispute about seating arrangements, a royal-level squabble over who deserved the highest place at the table. Regardless of the cause, it ended violently. Two brothers dead, stabbed in the heat of argument, their bodies slumped over whatever unfinished meal sat between them. A literal blood feud playing out with food still on the table. What makes this death so particularly strange is the contrast between setting and outcome. This wasn't a battlefield or a secret ambush. It was a family meal. A moment meant for diplomacy, or at least temporary civility, erupting into lethal absurdity. The Welsh tradition of fierce independence, deep family loyalty, and just as deep family conflict collided in one tragically ironic scene. Of course, the deaths of these two princes did little to settle the question of succession. Power shifted again, more brothers rose, and others fell. Gwynedd would remain a fragmented kingdom for years, caught in the wake of its founding king's prolific personal life and spectacularly dysfunctional heirs. But while most royal deaths occur at the sharp end of a sword or the slow turn of politics, this one reminds us that sometimes, in the strange world of monarchy, a knife at dinner can end a dynasty just as surely as a battle can. And speaking of strange endings, the next royal demise takes us from sibling rivalry to a death so ironic, it borders on the mythic. A Viking earl who tied a severed head to his saddle, only to discover it had one last bite left in it. 31. King Sigurd of Orkney, bitten by a severed head. When it comes to bizarre and poetic royal deaths, King Sigurd of Orkney's demise may well be in a category of its own, a tragicomedy written in blood and irony. Here was a Norse Gaelic warlord who survived brutal campaigns, conquered territories, and earned his place in saga and legend, only to be undone by what should have been a harmless trophy, the severed head of his defeated enemy. Let's back up. Sigurd Eysteinsson, also known as Sigurd the Mighty, was a 9th century Norse Earl of Orkney and Shetland, part of the vast Norse expansion that spread across the North Atlantic like a cold, ambitious fog. He was the brother of Ragnvald, a nobleman favored by the King of Norway. As part of the Norse push westward, Sigurd was granted control of the Orkney Islands, an archipelago rich in strategic value and poor in friendly neighbors. From there, Sigurd's ambition grew. He launched raids across northern Scotland, taking land, claiming titles, and clashing repeatedly with local chieftains and Pictish lords. One of his most persistent rivals was a man named Mael Brigte the Bucktoothed, a local Scottish noble with, evidently, memorable dental features. Their relationship, unsurprisingly, ended in war. According to the Orkney Inga saga, a semi-mythical Norse chronicle of the region's early history, Sigurd challenged Mael Brigte to a pitched battle, each to bring 40 men, meeting on equal terms. Sigurd, showing the time-honored Norse respect for balanced conflict, brought 80. The battle was a bloodbath. Sigurd won. Brigte and his men were slaughtered. To commemorate his victory, Sigurd did what any self-respecting 9th century Viking warlord might do. He had his fallen enemy's head severed and strapped to his saddle as a grisly war trophy. And here's where things turn from epic to absurd. As Sigurd rode triumphantly home, the jostling of the horse caused Brigte's head to bounce against his leg. But Brigte, though quite dead, had not yet finished fighting. The saga tells us that his protruding tooth, yes, the infamous bucktooth, scraped or punctured Sigurd's leg as the head swung from the saddle. The wound became infected, and Sigurd, conqueror of lands and breaker of treaties, died from it. It's hard to overstate how bizarre this is. A Viking warrior who survived blades, arrows, and the harshest elements imaginable, felled by a dead man's dental work. It's like something out of dark Norse slapstick. A final twist of fate so pointed, so almost literary, that it feels tailor-made for moralizing. And maybe that's why the story has stuck for over a millennium. Whether every detail is true or embellished doesn't really matter. Sigurd's death has lived on because it feels right. A punishment handed down not by gods or armies, but by the smug grin of poetic justice. To die from a posthumous bite is to die twice, once as a warrior and once as a punchline. In the end, Sigurd got his victory, but his trophy got the last word. And while his end came from an ironic accident, the next royal death brings us back to a more familiar setting, the banquet table, where too much of everything became the downfall of a Scottish king who couldn't say no to indulgence. 32. King David II of Scotland overindulged himself. In the catalogue of royal demises, there's a special shelf reserved for kings who were not defeated by swords, arrows, or palace intrigue, but by their own appetites. King David II of Scotland, son of the legendary Robert the Bruce, lived a life framed by warfare, captivity, and diplomatic crises. And yet, after all the battles, betrayals, and long negotiations, his story ends not with an enemy blade, but with an ominous and vague verdict from chroniclers. He overindulged himself. Translation? He quite possibly ate and drank himself to death. David was born in 1324 and inherited the Scottish throne at the tender age of 5, following the death of his father, Robert Rhys, the warrior king who had led Scotland to independence against England. Those were colossal shoes to fill, and David spent much of his life wobbling around inside them. His reign was marked by a series of invasions, occupations, and one especially humiliating capture. In 1346, during yet another cross-border scrap with the English, David was taken prisoner at the Battle of Neville's Cross and held in England for 11 years. During that time, Scotland was ruled in his absence by various regents. And though David was eventually ransomed and returned to his throne, the scars, both personal and political, ran deep. His rule never truly recovered. The nobles were fractious, the crown perpetually broke, and his attempts to secure a successor were repeatedly frustrated. David tried everything, including proposing that a son of the English king inherit the Scottish throne after him, an idea so unpopular that it nearly caused a civil war. And so, in the final stretch of his reign, David did what many disillusioned kings have done throughout history. He retreated into the pleasures of the court. He remarried, he feasted, he threw lavish banquets, and gradually the chroniclers stopped mentioning foreign policy and start mentioning excess. By the time he died in 1371, the official cause of death wasn't listed as poisoning, assassination, or war wounds. Instead, most sources say simply that David succumbed to a lifestyle of unchecked indulgence. No elaborate conspiracy, no climactic tragedy, just too much food, too much drink, and a body that finally said no more. It's a strangely anticlimactic ending for a king who had been through so much. A man who spent over a decade in enemy captivity, survived political uprisings, and navigated a kingdom in constant danger, brought down by his own comforts. If the earlier years of his life were forged in fire, the later years were drowned in wine sauce and royal fatigue. And yet, there's something oddly fitting about it. David II ruled in the long shadow of his father, the warrior king. He tried to make peace where others waged war. He failed often, but he survived longer than many expected. Perhaps by the end, he simply gave up trying to fight the inevitable. He died, childless, and with his death, the House of Bruce ended. The crown passed to the Stuarts, beginning a new and even more chaotic dynasty. But if David's ending was indulgent, the next prince's death was simply absurd. A young noble killed not by politics or poison, but in a petty squabble with his own men, possibly over food. 33. Prince John of Eltham, killed in a quarrel. If there's one thing that binds the tapestry of royal deaths together, it's this. You never quite know what will take a prince down. Sometimes it's a battlefield. Sometimes it's a plague. And sometimes, if you're Prince John of Eltham, it's an argument that gets out of hand in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong people. John of Eltham was born in 1316, the second son of King Edward II and Queen Isabella of France, which means he was born into a royal family already cracking under the weight of its own dysfunction. His father's reign was a disastrous mess of political favorites, lost wars, and eventual deposition. His mother led the charge to overthrow the king, and his older brother would grow up to become Edward III, one of England's most celebrated monarchs. So where did that leave John? Somewhere in between. Close enough to the throne to matter, but never quite at the center of it. He was given the title Earl of Cornwall at age 11, and was considered intelligent, able, and, according to some, more level-headed than his famously volatile relatives. He grew up in his brother's shadow, but not without his own ambitions. By his early 20s, John was entrusted with leading military campaigns, most notably during Edward III's invasion of Scotland in the early 1330s. It was during this campaign that his strange and poorly recorded death occurred, a royal tragedy that feels less like medieval warfare and more like a tale told at the back of a tavern. The year was 1336, and John was in the north of England, involved in the increasingly bitter conflict with the Scots. Tensions were high, supplies were short, tempers flared easily, and, according to scattered and conflicting chronicles, Prince John died during a quarrel with his own men. The details? Sparse. Some sources suggest it was a heated dispute with other commanders, possibly over military strategy or provisions. Others hint that the fight turned violent, and John was struck down in the chaos, possibly by accident, possibly not. There's even an unlikely version of the story that suggests a disagreement over dinner escalated into a deadly altercation. Whatever the truth, the outcome was the same. A prince dead in his mid-20s, not on the battlefield, but in what can only be described as a petty, preventable confrontation. What's particularly strange is the lack of royal investigation that followed. There was no national outcry, no great mourning. His body was returned and buried at Westminster Abbey, but his death was swept aside with minimal fuss. For someone so close to the crown, his end was almost quietly inconvenient, like a royal footnote no one wanted to read too closely. Some have speculated that Edward III, his older brother, may have intentionally buried the scandal, either out of embarrassment or because the truth was too awkward to publicize. A young prince representing royal authority killed by his own side? That wasn't a tale that made for inspiring sermons or proud retellings, so John of Eltham became the answer to a riddle no one bothered to finish. A promising royal figure undone by something so petty and ill-recorded that it left behind a legacy not of grandeur, but of frustrated curiosity. And yet, even in the odd company of royal deaths caused by dinner arguments and dental mishaps, John's demise feels like a fitting end to this long march through history's strangest royal farewells. A final reminder that for all their crowns and castles, even royals can go out in the most baffling, embarrassing, or absurd of ways. Because in the end, the throne might be gilded, but mortality never is.